I used to believe that civility could save anything, that if you smiled long enough, spoke softly enough, and dressed beautifully enough, you could smooth out the sharpest truths. That night, I learned how wrong I was. The dining room shimmered in candlelight. The crystal glasses caught the glow like tiny suns, and the air smelled faintly of roasted rosemary chicken, my third attempt that week at perfecting the recipe. The wine was decanted hours ago, breathing quietly on the counter as if preparing for an argument it already knew the outcome of. Miles sat across from me, checking his phone between sips of wine. "She should be here any minute," he said, his tone light, almost cheerful. She, of course, was Brooklyn, the ex-girlfriend I had foolishly invited to dinner. My idea, my grand demonstration of maturity. My attempt to prove to myself, more than to anyone, that our marriage was strong enough to host his past without threat. When the doorbell rang, I adjusted the pearl clasp at my neck. A small thing, but it mattered. The pearls were from our wedding anniversary chosen by Miles himself. They felt heavier that night, as if remembering something I didn't yet know. Brooklyn entered like a gust of expensive perfume, lilac and something citrusy, too bright for evening wear. She wore red, a deliberate shade that didn't pretend to be innocent. "Evelyn!" she exclaimed, arms open. "You look stunning as always," I smiled. "You too, Brooklyn. Please come in." Dinner began pleasantly enough. We laughed, exchanged shallow stories. Miles looked relieved, perhaps proud of me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the smooth gold of my wedding ring press against my skin. That ring had once felt like a promise. Lately, it felt like a restraint. Brooklyn was charming in that effortless way women learn to be when they want something. She asked about Miles's new projects, about my work, though she never waited for my full answers. When she spoke to him, her voice softened, laced with nostalgia. "You still make that awful pun about foundations, don't you?" she teased. Miles grinned, and something small in my chest cracked. I tried to drown it with wine. Dessert arrived. My grandmother's chocolate soufflé, delicate and trembling, a symbol of all the patience I had trained myself to perform. I watched the two of them laugh over some shared memory, one I hadn't been part of, and I realized that I was the outsider in my own home, and then it happened. Brooklyn leaned forward, resting her manicured hand lightly on Miles's wrist. "I can give you a baby if you want," she said, almost gently, "since your wife isn't capable of it." The words didn't hit like thunder. They came quietly, like silk being torn. I froze. The knife in my hand hovered above the porcelain plate. The clock on the mantel ticked once, then again, too loud. Miles didn't speak. He didn't pull his hand away. He didn't even look at me. In that stillness, something inside me finally went silent. I studied them both. Her, with her sympathetic eyes and poisoned grace. Him with his cowardly calm. I had spent years twisting myself into the shape of his ideal wife, only to realize that he preferred the memory of another woman. A small, bitter laugh almost escaped me, but I swallowed it. Instead, I smiled, a perfect hostess, flawless to the end. "Follow your heart," I said softly, almost as if giving permission. Brooklyn blinked, startled by my composure. Miles finally looked at me, confusion flickering behind his eyes. He didn't understand that something irreversible had just shifted. The rest of the evening unfolded in awkward fragments. Brooklyn left first, murmuring a hasty goodnight. Miles avoided my eyes, pretending to clean the dishes while I stood by the window, staring out at the dark city. When he finally came to bed, he kissed my forehead, the same automatic gesture he'd used for months, and fell asleep within minutes. His breathing filled the room, steady, oblivious. I lay there awake, the ceiling swimming in shadows. I replayed her words again and again, "since your wife isn't capable of it." I thought about the doctor's office, the cold stirrups, the soft-spoken apologies, the years of trying and failing. The look on Miles's face each time. Not anger, not sorrow, just quiet disappointment. I had tried to carry that weight alone, convincing myself love would compensate for biology. But in that moment, it all dissolved. The efforts, the sacrifices, the hope. I turned to face him. His mouth was slightly open, a line of drool catching the moonlight. He looked peaceful, almost innocent. I wanted to shake him awake, to ask why he hadn't defended me, why he had let someone humiliate me in our home. But what would be the point? He'd only say I was overreacting, that she didn't mean it. So instead, I got up. The hallway floor was cool under my feet. I paused by the mirror near the living room, catching my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked like someone else. Calm, pale, distant. My lipstick had faded. A faint red stain still clung to the rim of my wine glass on the table. Outside, the city lights flickered. Restless. Indifferent. They reminded me of the IVF monitor lights that used to beep faintly in the clinic rooms. Small, sterile reminders of hope that never arrived. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of extinguished candles and expensive betrayal. At dawn, I brewed coffee, strong, black. Miles shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. My voice sounded foreign. Smooth. Steady. He reached for the mug I'd prepared for him, kissed my cheek out of habit, and went on scrolling through his phone. I watched him. Every small gesture felt rehearsed. The love I'd once seen there now looked mechanical, like a man going through motions in a marriage that had long stopped being alive. He didn't notice when I slipped away into my study. The walls there were lined with art supplies I hadn't touched in months. Dust coated my brushes like a grave for forgotten passions. I opened my laptop. My hand didn't even tremble as I typed out a message to my lawyer, a woman I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Back when I had briefly thought about protecting my business assets, just in case. The email was simple. "I think it's time to talk." When I pressed send, I felt the faintest pulse of freedom. Outside, the first light of morning brushed across the windowsill, soft and golden. Somewhere behind me, Miles hummed to himself, unaware that our life, our carefully polished illusion, had just cracked beyond repair. And as I watched the sun rise over the skyline, I whispered to the empty room, "This time I won't fix it." Looking back, I can almost pinpoint the moment I mistook control for care. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderclap, no warning. Just a quiet seduction wrapped in admiration. I met Miles at a gallery opening. I was 29, independent, and running my own art studio downtown. My hands always smelled of turpentine, and my clothes carried specks of paint no matter how carefully I washed them. He found that endearing. He said I looked like someone who lived inside her art, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Miles was charming in the way men with money often are, practiced. Intentional, rehearsed, but convincing. He listened with the kind of focus that made you forget anyone else existed. When he touched my wrist lightly while laughing, I mistook the gesture for intimacy rather than calculation. Our early days felt cinematic. Weekend trips to the coast, long talks about building a future. He said he loved my independence, though I noticed how often he interrupted it. "You shouldn't exhaust yourself with clients," he'd say. "Let me take care of you." It sounded romantic then. By the time he proposed, my studio had become secondary to us. He said, "Why keep struggling when we can build something together?" I remember standing there in his arms, the scent of cedarwood and rain on his jacket, and thinking, maybe love means merging completely. When we married, I closed the studio. I told my friends it was temporary, that I wanted to help Miles rebrand his architecture firm. I even convinced myself it was creative work, designing brochures, photographing projects, rewriting client proposals. But in truth, I became a silent partner in his life, not his business. At first, people adored us. We were the couple others admired at dinners and refined, accomplished, always in sync. But I knew better. Miles began correcting me in small ways, gently at first. "Actually, Ev, that was last quarter's report," he'd say at meetings, smiling, hand on my knee as though it was affection. Later, he'd do it in public, in front of clients or friends. A subtle tightening of control. I'd laugh it off, pretending not to notice the sting. He liked things neat. My art supplies stayed boxed in a closet. He said the smell of paint distracted his focus. My perfume, the floral scent I wore since my 20s, he said was too sweet. So I switched to something subtle, woody, expensive. That's the thing about slow control. It feels like love until you can't breathe without permission. And then there was that look. The one he'd give when we passed children in the park, or when someone asked when we planned to have our own. It wasn't cruelty, but it was quiet disappointment. The kind that eats at you over years until you start apologizing for your body's silence. We tried everything. The charts, the doctors, the injections that left bruises on my stomach. Each cycle ended the same way: a sterile phone call, a quiet dinner, a night apart in the same bed. I still remember the clinic's smell, antiseptic and hope. He never said he blamed me, but he didn't have to. His silences said enough. Then one evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, his phone buzzed on the counter. The name Brooklyn glowed against the screen. I froze. I knew who she was. The ex who had once been too immature for him. The one he occasionally mentioned as proof of how much he'd grown. When I asked, his tone was casual. "Oh, it's nothing. She just reached out, catching up." I wanted to believe him. I truly did. That night, as I lay beside him, his breathing slow and even, I replayed that casual tone over and over. Just catching up. The words pressed against my chest like stones. I told myself I was overreacting, that marriage required trust. But beneath the rationalizing, something else was whispering, the voice I had long silenced. A few weeks later, he mentioned Brooklyn again in passing, as if testing my reaction. "She's doing well," he said, scrolling through his phone. "Opened a design firm," I smiled. "That's great." And that was when I made the mistake that would cost me my peace. I decided to prove I wasn't threatened. When I suggested inviting her to dinner, Miles looked surprised. "You'd really be comfortable with that?" "Of course," I said. "We're adults, aren't we?" He smiled, that small, approving smile that used to make me feel chosen. I didn't realize it was the smile of a man who knew he still had control. The following week, I began preparing. I cleaned every inch of the house until it gleamed, polished the wine glasses, ironed the linen napkins, set out our wedding china. It wasn't just about dinner. It was about displaying the perfection I had worked so hard to maintain. As I stood in the kitchen, arranging flowers for the table, lilies and white roses, my mother's voice echoed from years ago. "Don't mistake patience for virtue when it's actually fear." I had laughed back then, swirling my coffee and rolling my eyes like daughters do when mothers speak in riddles. But that night, as I looked around our home, the spotless counters, the staged dining room, the woman in the mirror wearing someone else's composure, I understood what she meant. Patience had become my disguise. Fear had been my religion. Even then, I didn't stop. I wore the silk dress Miles liked. The soft blue one, he said, made me look gentle. I sprayed the perfume he'd chosen for me, not the one I loved. The scent felt foreign, almost artificial. I remember thinking, if love has a smell, it shouldn't sting. That dinner became my final performance. I was the devoted wife hosting the ex, the woman proving that her marriage could survive anything. But deep down, something already knew. Civility was just the quiet before collapse. When Brooklyn's name appeared on my phone the day before confirming the time, my stomach knotted. I stared at the message. "Can't wait to catch up with you both. It's been too long." And felt an unease I couldn't name. That night, while folding napkins, I found one of our wedding photos tucked in a drawer, us smiling in sunlight, his arm around me, both looking toward the future as if it were guaranteed. I ran my finger over the glass, tracing the line of his face. And then I noticed something I'd never seen before. How tightly he held me. His hand gripping my shoulder, not resting on it. Possession disguised as affection. I put the photo back face down. The next evening would be the dinner, the one I believed would prove our stability. I didn't know it would instead reveal the truth I had been refusing to see. Love, when built on control, doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes slowly at one silence, one correction, one compromise at a time. And by the time you notice the cracks, the foundation has already crumbled. I thought hosting Brooklyn would show strength. What it really showed was how afraid I was of being unloved. And fear, I would learn soon, has a taste, metallic, like the back of a silver spoon pressed against your tongue. The morning light came through the blinds in thin, accusing lines, too bright, too clean for what I felt inside. Miles was already in the kitchen when I woke, the smell of coffee drifting through the hallway like something normal. Like routine hadn't become a kind of cruelty. He was humming softly, back turned, wearing the gray t-shirt I bought him last Christmas, the one he said made him look too casual for meetings. He poured coffee into 2 mugs and called over his shoulder. "Morning, Evie." His voice was warm, practiced, the same tone he used with clients. I sat at the counter, watching the steam rise from my cup. My hands were trembling, but I pressed them flat against the marble, forcing stillness. He looked up finally, smiling, that calm, polished smile that used to undo me. "Didn't sleep much?" he asked, as if the night before had been any other night. As if Brooklyn hadn't said those words. "I can give you a baby if you want." My throat burned. "No," I said, my voice thin. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "You shouldn't take what she said so seriously. You know how Brooklyn is. Impulsive, dramatic. She was just being kind." "Kind?" The word cut like glass. He shrugged, not looking up. "She meant well, you overreacted." I stared at him. The morning light touched his cheekbones, highlighting that calm detachment I once mistook for strength. "Do you really believe that?" He finally met my eyes. Not defensive, not ashamed, just tired. "Evelyn, you're being emotional again. Don't ruin a good morning." Something inside me snapped then, quiet and irreversible. I'd begged before. Begged doctors for miracles, begged myself to keep believing, begged him with my silences. But not this time. I stood up, walked past him, and whispered, "I'm done begging for love that should have been freely given." He frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. There was nothing left to explain. The house was painfully beautiful that day, the kind of beauty that mocked you. Every room carried traces of me, but none of them felt like mine anymore. The framed photo of our wedding day sat on the mantel, my hand in his, the ring shining like a promise that had aged into a lie. I walked through the rooms slowly, as though cataloging my own mistakes. The bedroom, where the air still carried his cologne and faint traces of my perfume. The one I stopped wearing after the second IVF. Failure because he said it reminded him of disappointment. The living room, where I used to paint on. Weekends before, he said my messy hobbies didn't match the image of a professional couple. The kitchen, where he'd kissed me once, right after I told him the first round failed. He said, "We'll try again," but his eyes had already drifted somewhere far away. Each object was a monument to the woman I had been. Gentle, accommodating, endlessly hopeful. By noon, the silence had grown unbearable. I opened the curtains, flooding the room with sunlight, and stared at the dust floating in the air. It looked like tiny ghosts dancing on the beams of light. My reflection caught in the glass window, pale, distant, unfamiliar. I whispered to her, "Who are you now?" No answer came, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock marking each second of a life I no longer recognized. When Miles left for work, I waited until I heard the sound of his car fade down the street. Then I walked into his study. It smelled like cedarwood and power, dark furniture, sleek lines, his awards neatly arranged on the shelf. The room had always been his kingdom, the one space I never entered without permission. My hands hesitated on the drawer handle. The metal was cold against my fingers. Inside, the truth waited, patient, merciless. There was a folder with design sketches, invoices, and contracts. Nothing unusual at first. But then I saw her name printed neatly at the top of one document, Brooklyn Harris, Consultant Design Collaboration. The date made my stomach turn. He'd hired her 2 months ago. The same month he told me he was working late on a major project. I flipped through the papers with shaking hands. Then came the emails, printed, organized, almost clinical in their intimacy. "You bring light into the dullest designs," he'd written once. "Can't wait to see you tonight." And then a photograph. Small, printed on glossy paper. Brooklyn sitting at his desk wearing my pearl earrings. The same ones I wore on our anniversary dinner. My knees buckled. I sank to the floor, paper scattering around me like confetti at a funeral. My chest burned. My breath came in ragged bursts, and the tears, they didn't even feel like tears anymore. Just salt and exhaustion. I pressed my palms to my eyes and wept until my throat went dry. The sound didn't even seem to belong to me. It was an animal sound, raw, wounded, distant. When the crying stopped, I lay there for a long time, surrounded by proof that I hadn't imagined the distance. Proof that my love had been outgrown. Proof that his silence had been another language entirely, one that said, "I don't choose you anymore," and yet, beneath all the hurt, there was a strange calmness, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I stood up, gathered the papers, placed them back exactly as they were. Then I walked to the mirror on the wall, the one I used to check my makeup before parties, when I still cared about appearing perfect. The woman in the reflection was hollow-eyed but alive. I looked at her and said quietly, "Enough." not in anger, not even in sorrow, just finality. That evening, when Miles returned, he found me sitting at the table with a cup of tea. He smiled absently, kissed the top of my head. "Long day," he murmured. "Yes," I said. It was. He didn't notice the slight tremor in my voice. He didn't notice anything anymore. Later that night, while he slept, I sat in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, my laptop open before me. The house was silent except for the soft rhythm of his breathing beside me. Steady, trusting, undeserved. I opened a new email. To Laura Kendrick, family law attorney. Subject, divorce consultation. The body was just 5 words. I'm ready to end this. I read it once, twice. My hand hovered over the send button. My wedding ring glinted in the lamplight, catching my eye. The same ring he slipped on my finger when he said, "I'll never let you go." I turned it slowly, felt the weight of it press into my skin. Then I clicked send. The message flew into the quiet night, unseen but liberating. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and exhaled, the first real breath I'd taken in years. Outside, the city pulsed faintly. Distant sirens, car horns, a world still turning. Inside, something had stopped turning forever. The next morning, when I woke, I didn't feel broken anymore. I just felt empty, like the space after a storm when the air is too still, too clean. But under that emptiness, I sensed it. The faintest spark of something unfamiliar. Not hope. Not yet freedom. The sky was still bruised with night when I left. A quiet, blue kind of darkness stretched over the city, heavy and calm, like it was holding its breath for me. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I moved through the apartment by memory, past the marble counters, the framed photographs of trips that felt staged, the empty perfume bottle still sitting on my vanity. I packed one suitcase. Just one. A few clothes, my sketchbooks, and the Polaroid camera Miles once mocked me for keeping. Too sentimental, he'd said. But I liked the way Polaroids trapped a moment in physical form, imperfect, unfiltered, unable to be edited later. Before I left, I took one last picture. The apartment in half-light. The empty bed. My coffee mug on the counter, a faint lipstick stain along its rim. The photo developed slowly, the image blurring into being. That was the moment I decided not to look back again. When the elevator doors closed, I felt something ease inside me. Like I'd been holding my breath for years. The road stretched out like a ribbon of freedom. The city fell away behind me, glass towers fading into mist, traffic lights flickering red and green in my rearview mirror until they disappeared completely. By sunrise, I reached the coast. My late aunt's cottage sat quietly at the edge of a small, wind-bent field, overlooking the gray sea. The paint was peeling, the shutters creaked, and the scent of salt and earth filled the air. It wasn't luxury. It was honesty. Inside, the walls still smelled faintly of lavender soap and turpentine. She had been a painter, too. I found her old easel leaning in the corner, covered in dust but waiting. That first night, I didn't unpack properly. I just opened the windows and listened to the sea breathing outside. The wind moved through the curtains like a hand brushing through hair. I curled up on the small bed, wearing a sweater too big for me, and let the quiet settle. It was the first silence that didn't hurt. The days passed slowly. I painted again. Clumsy at first, my fingers stiff, my colors uncertain. The first thing I painted was a window fogged with rain. Then a hand pressed against it, half visible. Then nothing at all. Just light, breaking through mist. The canvases filled the walls one by one, each one a conversation I hadn't known how to start. I painted what I couldn't say. Grief, longing, relief, and somewhere in between. The beginning of freedom. The act of creating again felt like breathing through scar tissue. Every stroke a small rebellion. At night, I read the emails from my lawyer, drafts, documents, settlements. The legal language was cold, factual, stripped of emotion, but to me, each clause felt like a victory. A small piece of myself being returned. I'd sign, save, and close my laptop, then stare at the Polaroid of the apartment pinned to the wall above my bed. It reminded me what I'd escaped from. Not just a man, but the version of myself who believed silence was love. Weeks went by before I told anyone. Then one afternoon, I called Clara. When she picked up, I didn't even say hello. I just breathed out, "It's over." There was a pause. A long, soft silence filled with understanding. Then her voice, low and steady. "About time, Evie." I laughed through the ache in my throat. I thought I'd feel proud. "But I just feel empty." "That's not emptiness," she said. "That's space. You're finally giving yourself room to exist." She came to visit the following weekend, bringing with her a basket of groceries and her usual stubborn warmth. She didn't pity me. She never had. Instead, she asked about my paintings, about the sea, about whether I'd eaten anything that wasn't toast. We sat on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the waves crash in slow, patient rhythm. The wind tangled my hair, and for the first time in years, I didn't care how I looked. "You used to laugh like this all the time," Clara said softly. "Did I?" "Yes, before him. Before you started making yourself small enough to fit inside his silences." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, I stood before the mirror and tried to see the woman she was talking about, the one who used to laugh without apology. Maybe she was still in there, waiting. Every morning, I'd walk along the beach with my camera. I took photos of driftwood, of clouds, of my bare feet sinking into wet sand. The sea was a constant companion, unpredictable, untamable, honest. It reminded me that not all storms are disasters. Some wash things clean. I found a kind of rhythm. Wake, paint, walk, cook, read, sleep. Days became weeks, and the ache began to dull, softening into something manageable. One afternoon, while buying groceries at the small market in town, I saw a young couple by the fruit stand. They were holding hands, laughing over something small and silly. Maybe an overripe peach. Maybe nothing at all. For a moment, I watched them, waiting for the usual pang, the envy, the grief, the sense of being left behind, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt distant, almost serene. Like I was watching another lifetime play out, one I'd already lived and survived. That night, I painted again. Not sadness this time, not loss, just color. Warm, messy, alive color. Reds, yellows, streaks of blue. It looked nothing like anything I'd painted before. And when I stepped back, I realized it was the first painting that didn't look like pain. A few days later, I found myself digging through one of my old sketchbooks. Inside was a page with a list written years ago, a list of things I wanted to do someday. Visit Florence. Paint for no reason. Sleep in the middle of the day. Take a Polaroid of every sunrise, I smiled. The handwriting was so neat, so hopeful. I hadn't crossed off a single item. Until now. So I tore the page out and pinned it next to the Polaroid of my old life. One represented everything I'd endured. The other, everything still waiting. Healing wasn't linear. Some days I missed him, or maybe I missed the person I used to be with him, the dream of being loved the way I had loved. But then I'd look out at the sea, endless and indifferent, and remember that not all love is meant to last. Some love just teaches you where to draw the line between devotion and disappearance. One morning, the lawyer called. The divorce was finalized. Just like that. A line signed, a name released. After I hung up, I didn't cry. I just stood on the porch with the wind in my hair and whispered, "Thank you." Not to him, but to myself, for finally leaving, for surviving, for rediscovering the art of being whole. That evening, I took another Polaroid. The sea. The sky streaked pink with sunset. And in the corner, my hand holding the camera steady. When the photo developed, I placed it next to the others. 3 moments, the past, the escape, and now. It wasn't a complete story yet, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. It's strange how peace doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly, through the sound of waves you no longer cry to, through mornings where you forget to check your phone for messages that will never come. Through the steady rhythm of your own breath when you realize you're not waiting for someone else to validate your existence. By the time spring returned, I was no longer a woman escaping. I was simply living. My art had taken on a new shape. I called the series Still Life with Ghosts. Each canvas was layered, translucent colors and faint outlines of forgotten objects, a wine glass, a wedding ring, a half-open door. They weren't about loss anymore. They were about remembering without pain. I started posting photos of my paintings online, quietly at first, without expectation. Within weeks, messages began flooding in. People, and mostly women, wrote to me from everywhere. They saw themselves in my art. One wrote, I thought I was the only one who lost herself trying to be someone's piece. Their words made me realize I wasn't invisible anymore. I was heard. One afternoon, I received an email from a gallery in Seattle. They wanted to feature my collection. The haunting serenity of a woman reclaiming her silence, they called it. I read the line twice, my hands trembling. It felt surreal, like being recognized by the universe after years of whispering into walls. Clara was the first person I called. "You're finally being seen. Evie," she said, her voice glowing through the phone. "I'm proud of you." "I'm proud of her too," I whispered, meaning the woman I used to be. The one who stayed, endured, and finally left. The days grew lighter, and so did I. I started jogging again, cooking properly, even buying flowers for myself every Sunday. The cottage became a sanctuary. Canvases lined the walls, Polaroids of the sea framed the windows. My reflection no longer startled me. I looked grounded, but healing has a way of inviting tests. It happened one morning just after sunrise. My lawyer's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer. I'd grown used to peace, to conversations that didn't involve Miles's name. But something in my gut told me to pick up. "Evelyn," she said gently, "you should know. Your husband tried to freeze your joint assets this week." I laughed. It wasn't the reaction she expected. "He what?" "He's claiming you're unstable. That you've been emotionally erratic and financially irresponsible. He's attempting to undermine the settlement terms." For a moment, I said nothing. I looked out at the waves, calm and infinite, and felt a strange sense of detachment. The old Evelyn, the one who begged for love, who cried through endless nights, would have been shattered. But this Evelyn? She just smiled faintly. "Good," I said softly. "Let him try." What Miles didn't know was that I had spent months quietly documenting everything. Every secret transaction. Every falsified expense. Every consultant payment that went directly to Brooklyn under a fake company name. He had taught me control. I had learned precision. While he underestimated me, assuming I'd fade into obscurity, I had spent my solitude gathering proof, not out of vengeance, but out of self-respect. That week, I sent a single email to my lawyer attaching the documents. There was no malice in my tone, only calm instruction. "Please ensure this reaches the relevant investors and partners," I wrote. "They deserve to know." The collapse began within days. His firm, once the talk of design magazines, unraveled like silk pulled apart at the seams. Investors withdrew. Clients backed out. Whispers spread about embezzlement, tax discrepancies, misused funds. The press devoured it. Brooklyn's name appeared once in a headline. "Architect's mistress implicated in financial misconduct." Then she disappeared, vanishing like a shadow when the lights turned on. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching someone self-destruct, just inevitability. Miles had always built his empire on illusion, charm, manipulation, appearances. I had simply taken away the curtain. A week later, an auction notice appeared online. The firm was liquidating its assets, art, furniture, property. I stared at the list without emotion until one line caught my breath. Lot 37, untitled painting, claimed by Ems Callahan, medium, oil on canvas. I knew that painting. It was mine. I had painted it in our first year of marriage, a quiet, abstract depiction of two figures drifting apart under rain. He'd loved it, called it his muse, and insisted on displaying it in his office. Later, he claimed it as his own design concept and told investors it inspired his award-winning glass installation. It felt symbolic, poetic even, that it was being sold among the ruins of his empire. The day of the auction, I wore a cream dress and a small pendant shaped like a wave. I wanted to be invisible in the crowd, just another face observing what was once untouchable. When they unveiled the painting, I almost didn't recognize it. The colors had dulled under the office lights, the frame slightly chipped. Still, it was mine. My ghost on canvas. The bidding started low. 2,000. 3. 4. At 5,000, I raised my paddle, steady and deliberate. The room went still for a moment. The auctioneer nodded. Sold. And just like that, I owned it again. When I brought it back to the cottage, I didn't cry. I just hung it by the window where the light hit it softly at dusk. The colors looked different now, alive again, like they'd been waiting for this air. I touched the edge of the canvas and whispered, "Mine again." That evening, I wrote a post for my small but growing online audience. Not about revenge or justice or even betrayal, but about returning to yourself. I wrote, "They say healing is quiet, but it's also brave. Sometimes it means watching what broke you collapse without lifting a finger. Sometimes it means reclaiming the pieces they took and breathing life back into them. I am not what happened to me. I am what I chose to become after." The post went viral overnight. Tens of thousands of women shared it. My inbox overflowed with stories. Women who had left, rebuilt, started over. Some wrote in whispers, afraid to be found. Others shouted their freedom through digital tears. For the first time, I realized my story wasn't small. It was a thread in a vast tapestry of survival. A few months later, the gallery opening in Seattle became a turning point. I stood before my paintings, the ghosts, the colors, the rebirth, and felt completely detached from the woman who once begged for love. During the press interview, a journalist asked, "Are these paintings about forgiveness?" I thought about it, about the years I wasted softening myself for a man who mistook submission for love. "No," I said finally. "They're about remembering you were whole before someone tried to convince you otherwise." The night of the opening, I returned to the cottage and poured a glass of wine. I opened the window and let the salt wind in. The moonlight reflected off the Polaroids on my wall, the apartment, the sea, the sunset. I took one more photo, holding the glass up like a toast. When the image developed, I smiled. The woman in the photo wasn't broken. She wasn't surviving. She was becoming. I never heard from Miles again, not directly. Rumor said he left the city, tried to start fresh somewhere smaller, quieter. I didn't care. His silence was the only apology I ever needed. Sometimes, when I look at the sea, I think of the life I left. The dinner table, the cruelty disguised as pity, the woman who smiled and said, "Follow your heart," while her own cracked in two. That version of me died that night. But she made room for someone stronger, someone who learned that revenge doesn't have to be loud. It can be calm. It can be elegant. It can look like peace. The courthouse was colder than I remembered. Not the kind of cold that chills your skin, but the kind that sinks deeper into your bones. The kind that belongs to places where endings live. The marble floors stretched endlessly in every direction, polished so perfectly that my reflection shimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights. I looked at myself and barely recognized the woman standing there. Hair neatly pulled back, pearl earrings gleaming softly, the same ones Brooklyn once wore in that photograph. The irony didn't sting anymore. It simply existed, like the faint hum of the lights above. Miles arrived 5 minutes late, as he always did when he wanted to feel in control. His tie was crooked, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw unshaven, the quiet unraveling of a man who had spent months pretending he still held the narrative. He nodded at me, a small, almost polite gesture. I didn't return it. When we were ushered inside the courtroom, my lawyer gave me a small nod. Reassurance, though I didn't need it anymore. The papers had been signed, the evidence presented. The end had already been written. This was just the reading of it aloud. Miles's lawyer began speaking first, his tone carefully measured, trying to dress Miles's desperation in language that sounded like remorse. "My client deeply regrets the emotional harm caused," he said, "and wishes to reconcile, to rebuild what was once a partnership of love and mutual respect." Love. Respect. Words I had once worshipped like gods, now reduced to courtroom jargon. When it was my turn, I stood, my hands clasped in front of me. The judge, a woman with kind, tired eyes, asked gently, "Mrs. Hartley, do you have anything you wish to say before we conclude?" For a brief moment, I thought of silence, of letting the documents speak for me, the ones that contained his forged signatures, his secret transfers, the photographs and messages that once shattered me but now served as bricks in the wall of my new beginning. But then I remembered the years I'd spent swallowing words. The dinners where he'd spoken over me, the mornings where I'd worn smiles like armor. The quiet I had mistaken for peace, so I spoke. "I once thought marriage meant merging souls," I said slowly, my voice steady but alive. "But I learned that sometimes it means reclaiming your own." The judge watched me, perhaps seeing. In that moment, 1,000 women she'd seen before, all standing in that same fragile strength. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I continued. "I'm here to set myself free." Miles looked up then, eyes glistening. "Evelyn, please," he whispered. "I made mistakes, but you can't just erase everything we had." I turned to him, the calmness inside me so complete it almost frightened me. "I'm not erasing anything," I said. "I'm simply choosing not to carry it anymore." There was a time when his sorrow could have undone me, when the sight of his trembling hands, the crack in his voice, would have sent me spiraling back into the hope that maybe, just maybe, love could heal what pride had broken. But that time had passed. When the judge announced the final verdict, full divorce, restoration of assets, ownership of my artwork and brand, I didn't feel victorious. I felt weightless. Outside the courthouse, the world looked almost too bright. Sunlight spilled across the marble steps, warm and unrelenting. People moved around me, lawyers, couples, reporters, but their sounds blurred into a distant hum. I reached into my purse and felt the small velvet pouch I'd brought with me. Inside was the ring, simple gold, worn smooth at the edges. I hadn't worn it in months, but I'd carried it. Habit, perhaps. Or memory. At the corner of the courthouse stood a small wooden donation box belonging to a women's shelter. I'd noticed it on the way in, its handwritten sign, "For those rebuilding." Without hesitation, I dropped the ring inside. It landed with a soft metallic sound. Faint, final, almost tender. Not an ending. A beginning. For a long time, I just stood there watching the sunlight glint off the courthouse doors, watching people pass with their own invisible burdens. Then I turned and walked toward my car, the city stretching out before me like a photograph I was no longer in. The drive to the coast took 4 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was different now, not oppressive, but sacred. A companion rather than a punishment. The road curved past old farmlands and sleepy towns, through tunnels where echoes of my tires sounded like heartbeats. When I finally reached the cottage, the sea greeted me like an old friend. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Inside, the light poured through the tall windows, illuminating everything. The easel, the half-finished painting, the mug of brushes, the Polaroid camera that sat on the sill. The camera still worked, though its photos came out slightly blurred, as if refusing to capture anything too sharply. I unpacked slowly. The court documents went into a drawer. The old wedding photos, the ones I hadn't yet thrown away, I placed in a box and slid under the bed. I wasn't ready to burn them. Not out of sentimentality, but respect. They were part of the story that brought me here. On the small wooden table by the window, my lawyer had left the final settlement check. It sat beside my sketchbook, which was filled with drawings of hands, open, reaching, releasing. I hadn't realized how many times I'd drawn that same gesture until now. Letting go. That evening, I poured a glass of white wine and stepped outside. The sea was quiet, the waves rolling gently like breath. Across the horizon, the last light of the sun burned gold, fading into indigo. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the unraveling, the escape, the rebuilding. And I thought about Miles, wherever he was now. Whether he still blamed me, or himself, or the world, and I realized it didn't matter. I didn't need his apology anymore. Closure wasn't something he could give me. It was something I had already painted, written, and lived. Inside, my canvas waited, blank, patient, shimmering faintly in the low light. I set down my wine and picked up a brush. The first stroke was hesitant, then sure. Lines became shapes, shapes became color, color became something alive. I wasn't painting grief anymore. I was painting air, space, freedom. The smell of paint mingled with salt, the breeze carrying both through the open window. Somewhere in the distance, a lighthouse blinked, steady and sure. I smiled. For real this time. Not because I'd won, but because I had survived beautifully. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone's wife, someone's reflection, someone's afterthought. I felt like myself, and as I painted, I whispered softly, maybe to the sea, maybe to the woman I used to be, or, "We made it."